Alex,
Yes, sir.
it's really cold, and my sister texted me earlier this week, and she says, Tyler, do you think the trees are going to explode?
So in our area, it hasn't been quite cold enough for long enough, but
That's what I told her. I explained to her, I'm like, hey, probably not, because it has to be really cold, because, yes, water freezes and it expands as it freezes, but the more pressure it's under, the lower the temperature has to be for it to freeze.
yes,
So in the xylem and phloem, in the vascular system of the plants, it's
specifically trees.
specifically
And
trees.
mostly trees, but woody plants, but this is primarily a tree problem.
Yeah. They're able, yeah. If it gets cold enough for long enough, it will freeze. And there's nowhere for it to go because it's so woody and herbate, it's so woody and stiff that it just kind of pops. So, but luckily for us, we haven't had nearly that problem yet. It hasn't been nearly cold enough. So the water in the vascular systems of the plants are not cold enough. But it is very cold still. This is the week, that really bad snowstorm. Supposedly, in the U.S. It hasn't started snowing yet here, I don't think.
No,
I haven't
it's
looked out my window.
supposed to overnight, and it is. I'm trying to see if I can find a quick little video just to show the trees exploding. So basically what happens is as the water inside like the trees expands to the point where the trees themselves cannot contain the pressure anymore, it will actually blow the wood open, not just do open in some cases, like actually apart to where the tree just falls apart or it like basically peels back the bark. It's kind of crazy to watch. I mean,
just in deep thought looking for a video.
I found a good one. Hold on.
Heck yeah.
I pulled one up real quick. Just a nice little YouTube short I found from this gentleman here. We got to give him credit because we're borrowing his video. All right, folks.
Yeah, pretty much.
That right there.
They just get, too much pressure in there.
Too much pressure, and it just poof blows them apart. And that looked like it was I think it was a cherry tree, which tend to have are not exceptionally strong trees to begin with. So something like that. Their bark is fairly thin, and that tree looked like it had problems already. So yeah, they're not always that spectacular. Sometimes it's just the bark kind of blows off,
it just pops off.
But I've seen it where it's just like whole big branches just poof.
They're also very loud when they explode.
Yes, yeah, because if you think about how loud a tree is when it falls, and that's like controlled. Now, if you think something like that where it's already held together by so much force from all the like the lignin and everything inside the tree, holding it together, and the bark is basically like a big, like, if you think of like bubble wrap, the bark is like the wrap of in each bubble, just holding that pressure in, and when you push enough pressure out, it pops. That's the easiest way to describe that.
But I am Tyler, that is Alex. We are your hosts for Life the Complete Story. As always, we will get started with art, nature, and the news. Today's article comes from the University of California, Santa Barbara, the banana slugs. So this article is titled, Marine Dark Waves, Hidden Ocean Blackouts Are Putting Sea Life at Risk. And the whole premise is that, clouds, smoke, fog, those are all kind of natural effects of like what blocks out the sun in an ocean ecosystem. However, we're getting a lot of like runoff and algae blooms and a lot of debris like plastic waste and things like that are also causing a lack of sunlight in these ocean ecosystems. And we're starting to see the impacts that has on those ecosystems. Specifically, we're talking like coral reefs, kelp forests, things like that rely so heavily on plants or other things that photosynthesize. Because what happens is the sun is blocked out and the plants aren't able to photosynthesize as well since there's not as much sunlight. And that kind of like tanks the rest of the ecosystem because there's not as much food being produced at the producer level.
Yeah. So once you lose that, you start to lose the oxygen within that area of the ocean, especially if the producers that are there die, they start to decay, similar to how algae blooms are so deadly. Same thing, once those start to decay and the things that the decomposers start to use up all the oxygen in the area, and then you get little pockets of dead zones, basically.
Right. And before, the research was really focused on like a long-term like blackout, but now we're realizing that like even short-term breaks, like a couple days, 2 or 3 days, can have just the same effect as like a long-term blackout. But that's really all I have on it. It's a really short article with not a whole bunch of like actual like data. But they used a couple data points, 16 years of measurements, off the coast of Santa Barbara and 10 years from New Zealand and the local area there. And they found 25 to 80 dark wave events along the East Cape of California since 2002, associated with powerful storms and a lot of big weather system events like cyclones and hurricanes and things like that. Anything else, Alex?
I think you got it pretty well covered.
All right, we'll move on into our lesson. As we said last week, splitting our Mesobatrachia, so our middle frogs, into two separate parts. So we're going to cover the second half today. And we have 3 groups to go over, and then we'll wrap up the middle frogs. And we have one last group of frogs to cover. But our first group of the day is going to be Pippidae. Alex, what is Pippidae?
Yes, sir. So Pippidae are these guys. They are the primitive tongueless frogs. So there are 41 members that are found in the tropical areas, primarily South America and Africa. They are highly aquatic. So their feet are completely webbed. You can kind of see in the picture here, especially those back feet. They have extensive webbing, which means it makes it a lot easier for them to swim. Very flattened bodies, you can see in the picture as well. The adults actually possess a lateral line, so along the, like we talked about with the fish, that kind of line of receptors along the kind of middle of the body helps them sense the water around them. And they actually have modified ears that are able to receive sounds underwater. Pretty much up to this point, there are almost a ton of modifications for that fully aquatic life. They lack vocal cords, and as the names first said suggest, they lack a tongue. So they actually use bony rods that were within the larynx, so kind of like the upper throat, for sound production, and I'm sure that also helps with swallowing as well. Maybe not as much in the larynx. That's usually more like the windpipe, but they use that to create sounds. Ranging from 1.5 to 7.5 inches, so pretty decent sized frogs. The members of this group cover a couple pretty cool, as well as one really uncomfortable frog and toads, such as the dwarf clawed frog, which are very popular pets, African clawed frogs, which are organisms used a lot for gene expression and other DNA studies, and they are called clawed frogs. They don't actually have claws. What they will do is when threatened, they actually have a little bony plate in their fingers that holds the finger bones in, and when threatened, they basically break their fingers, and that bone slides down and pushes out and acts like a claw. I'm sure it doesn't feel good, but they are specifically designed for that. They do it on purpose. It's not just something that just happens, and then at that point, it's basically like the frog loses the use of the hand. And then as well, the Suriname toad, which have a very unique caretaking strategy for their young. Tyler, I'll let you explain that.
Yeah, Alex is uncomfy with Suriname toads.
A little bit.
So, a Suriname toad.
I'm gonna.
That's a Suriname toad on the picture that you have already.
Is it? Well, I'm gonna pull up the picture just so everyone else can be uncomfortable with us. There you go. That's Suriname toad.
During reproduction, after the eggs are fertilized, the male kind of like puts the eggs onto the female's back, and then they live there on the back, and then the tadpoles also develop in the back of the female. So all of the juvenile life stage of a Suriname toad takes place within the dorsal side of the female frog.
Yes, and it is like a specially developed skin thing that they do. So like this is they've developed to do this. It's not a bad care strategy because the larger adult frogs protect the young for longer. And then once they develop into mostly mature tadpoles, they will then swim out of the holes in the mother's back and live on their own. But it's just, I forget the name of that phobia, or like the fear of like holes like that. But if you have that, I apologize now. I should have apologized ahead of time for this because it's
good job, Alex.
Comfortable.
That'll bring us into our next group, which is going to be Scaphiopotidae. These are our third group of spadefoot toads, I believe. Or second, I don't remember. We covered a group last week too of spadefoot toads. But these are specifically the American spadefoot toads, native to North America. Fairly small group, only a couple species. I think I counted 7 when I was doing the research today. As the name suggests, they are burrowing toads, and they have that keratinous protrusion on their hind legs. So spadefoot toads will always burrow backwards, using their hind legs to dig through sandy soil. And they differ from true toads because they have vertical pupils and lack a parotoid gland, which is kind of like the external gland that releases like the neurotoxins and stuff like that. It's a defensive mechanism. These guys are dull in color, typically dull gray or brown, kind of on the average end of size, 2 to 3 inches. And they are found in arid climates underneath of like creek beds, perennial ponds, things like that. Things that are known to retain their water under the surface pretty well. I think that's everything.
That last point there,
Right.
yeah.
So that when they burrow, they lay dormant underground, and then they're like kind of cue to wake up is whenever it rains and like a loud thunderstorm. Frequencies on thunder actually kind of wake them up, and they'll start to come towards the surface to get some moisture, go feed, whatever.
That will take us then to our final group, family Rhinophorinidae. These are the Mexican burrowing toad. There's only
Look at that guy.
one member in this family. He's kind of funky looking. They have their very
specific family.
Yes, it is a very unique morphology. As you can see, they have a very pointed snout and face, as opposed to the typically very rounded head and face of most other frogs, as well as the head being much smaller compared to the rest of the body, which is pretty unique. And they actually have the keratinized structures are on their front limbs, not their rear limbs.
Yes, so they actually dig forward.
Yes, and that's probably why they have the very small, rounded head. They have a very specialized tongue that they use for feeding on ants and termites, so that goes along with the burrowing. They probably dig into ant and termite burrows and feed on the ants and termites that live inside. Their body is that dark black color with the reddish-orange stripe along the back, as well as some of the spotting along the sides. The name in Greek means nose toad, so rhino typically refers to like the nose or the snout.
And then Furnace toad.
Yeah. They diverged over 190 million years ago, further than mammals began to diverge from one another. So this is a very old species, very old family. And as you can kind of see in the picture, the bodies are very flat, and then they are nearly as wide as they are long. So they are rather rotund little guys. But I don't know if it said kind of the general size for these guys. Doesn't really look like it.
We're looking at
what
about
I can see
3 to 3.5 inches.
Okay, so a moderate size. That name, the Mexican burrowing toad, suggests they live in Mexico, kind of from the not quite to the border of Texas, but along that east coast all the way. They're very, very concentrated in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then a little bit along the southern coast down into like Costa Rica and Honduras, I believe that is as well. But primarily in Mexico.
Anything else to add?
Nope, that's all I got for
All right.
our lesson today. Another kind of shorter lesson, but we didn't want to overwhelm everyone with a whole bunch of frogs all at once. Because
this group was weird because it like took up just enough space that it was like too much for one episode, but not quite enough to fill 2 complete episodes, like 2 full-length episodes.
Yes.
But we have one final group of frogs to go over for the next couple weeks. It's the biggest one. It's your Neobatrachia, so they're like the New World frogs and the most highly developed frogs. But the episode's not over. We still have all our other stuff to do. So, for today's amazing species, I have pulled, pause for effect, as I pulled
Perfect.
up the western spadefoot. I had to pull it up still. So these guys are found all throughout California, from basically right up to the Baja Peninsula, all the way up to the
Bingo.
Sierra Nevada, kind of like through the Cascade Range.
Yeah, pretty much from about pretty much from San Diego, the border with Mexico, almost to the northern border of California, to, like Tyler said, the Cascade Range. There's a lot of national forests up there, like Six Rivers National Forest, Austin National Forest, up into that area, and primarily through the central basin of California until about San Jose, and then you get them more along the coast as well.
All right, so these guys were assessed in 2021 with a published date in 2022, and they're listed as near threatened because even though it has quite a range, we are believed to think that it has had a significant decline, about 20 to 30% within the past 15 years, due to a lot of habitat loss, which makes it more close to vulnerable than near threatened, which is what its current listing is. So the IUCN actually lists it reaching into Mexico as well in that Baja Peninsula. So that's just us not reading a map.
Yeah, I think it's just the way the map is kind of showing. They may not have studied down. I see one little dot down in Baja California. Okay.
But they live anywhere from sea level all the way up to about 1,300 meters above sea level, but most commonly found below 365 meters above. There has been genetic work that says that the northern population and the southern populations are a distinct subspecies separated by the transverse range of California. And they show no evidence of like interbreeding between those two populations.
The main thing is that separation as two different species is not a recognized separation yet. So that's why they're still treated as one species instead of like a northern and southern western spadefoot.
Right. So these guys have been kind of in decline since the 50s. Over 80% of their previous occupation has been developed into some type of incompatible use, whether it's industry, residential, whatever. About 7,000 acres were lost just between 2005 and 2012 alone due to agriculture and development, which is a 26% loss in habitat, that's 7,000 acres. They have a generation length of 5 years, so that's where we get that over 15 years, they decline 30%. That's how we get your IUCN listing is decline over 3 generation length.
Fortunately, they do have kind of a wide range of habitat, as much of that part of California. The habitat changes pretty quickly.
Pretty frequently, yeah.
Yeah, you get like the grasslands and foothills all the way into some of like the woodlands and chaparral, as well as the sagebrush along the coast and the edge of the deserts in the east.
And these guys are under threat to your usual culprits: commercial, residential development, agriculture, climate change. California is known to have droughts and wildfires abundantly, although there also is invasive species such as the American bullfrog and the mosquito fish, which also contribute to the decline. And the most successful breeding spots are the vernal ponds that kind of like show up and then disappear. So nothing can really, those things that have longer incubation periods and things like that don't survive as well in those areas. They occur in some protected areas, specifically the University of California's Natural Reserve, as well as some U.S. federal conservation plans. It is a California species of special concern, and is under review for the Endangered Species Act. That is all I have, Alex. Anything else you want to add?
Nope, that's all I've got for these guys.
All right, let's pass it back over to you.
Yes, sir. I will bring it in for the most wanted for this week.
Yeah, we got to switch up today.
I did switch it up a little bit today. So today we are talking about a plant. It is the Japanese barberry. Let me scoop up a picture here. There we go. So the Japanese barberry is Berberis thunbergi. It is as you can kind of see, is a deciduous shrub native to Japan as well as some of the eastern parts of Asia. Gets between 2 and 8 feet tall, so it's about half a meter up to almost 2.5 meters. They have very thin, grooved branches that have some very thin, straight spines on them. They are very sharp and spiky. It sucks to walk through. Let me tell you, I walked through more than my fair share of it for work. They are very shade tolerant, so they actually form dense stands of the bushes and shade out and displace native species, especially native bushes. And with it, they do have small berries that some birds will eat, which is actually part of the problem because then the birds will disperse the seeds even more. Initially introduced into the United States in the 60s as an ornamental plant and still is used widely for landscaping and hedges. But it is because of the way this plant is, kind of the way it grows, and with it being so thick, having those small branches, this plant has actually been found to be a hotbed for ticks. So my parents used to have some of these in their landscaping until my dad found that out, and they were promptly removed because we did not want. I think this was after my mother had wound up with Lyme disease, and then we were not messing around with that. But those berries, they are a very bright red color. They're fairly small, about 1/4 inch long. They kind of fruit in like the spring to summer. It says this plant is very tolerant to a variety of habitats like shaded woodlands, open fields, wetlands, things like that. Currently, it's found mostly in the eastern United States, with the most hotbed being kind of upper Appalachia surrounding the Great Lakes region. And then it is starting to be found in a little further west into like Oregon. I can't tell if that's Montana or like Colorado, one of those states. So it is slowly spreading west, but the vast majority of it is in the northeastern United States as well as into Canada a little bit, focusing on the Great Lakes region. But yeah, if you have any of these in your landscaping like this, like they are very pretty. Kind of later in the year, they get this nice red color in the leaves in the fall. But if you do have this in your landscaping, get rid of it, dig it out, bag it up and throw it away, or burn it, because they will transplant if you do not. You just kind of throw it into the woods or wherever it can continue to grow, can kind of reestablish.
Interesting. Anything else, Alex?
That's all I got on them today.
All right, on to our next segment from the vault. Today's from the vault is the Temnospondyli. These come from the Greek word cut vertebrae, and they are a ancient order of tetrapods, amphibians, although they look more like miniaturized crocodilians, which a lot of the like groupings within Temnospondyli have the suffix suchus, which is a common suffix in crocodiliforms, things like that. And they have a triangular skull from above, semi-aquatic, and they have dorsally facing orbits, so they're kind of like mounted on their head, kind of like a crocodile, so they can kind of see above water, like you know how the alligators and crocodiles are, where they kind of like have just their eyes above the water. These guys are kind of similar, able to do the same thing. They're kind of one of our older amphibian fossils, dating back to the 19th century, early 19th century. Initially thought to be reptiles based off of their body form and that nature. So the current hotbed for discussion with these guys is whether they're ancestors to all modern amphibians or if they died out without leaving any descendants. So it's which one do amphibians come from? The leptospondylus or the temnospondyls? I covered leptospondylus a couple weeks ago, I believe. But other than that, I don't have much else for these guys because a lot of it is really just like bone structure and things like that, because that's really all you can go off of for fossils.
Yeah.
And I don't want to bore you guys with that. So, Alex, I will kick it back over to you. What's really more of a group discussion for the Ecology Encyclopedia? Today's Ecology Encyclopedia is
survivorship curves. So
right.
this one is, you can kind of see in the picture I've pulled up, this has a lot to do with kind of breeding strategy is what this boils down to. So there's 3 types of survivorship curves that really are talked about. Type 1, 2, and 3 is how they're labeled. Type 1 is things like your larger mammals, like humans, whales, things like that, that tend to have very few young at a time, but those young very often survive to adulthood. And so with that, in the graph that is, the image I pulled up is kind of a graph that shows the number of survivors for each generation over the age. So type 1, like people, you have very few young at a time, typically 1, 2, even 3. But the vast majority of those young make it to adulthood, and then at that point they survive for a long time until they start getting pretty advanced in age, and then at that point the numbers of individuals drops off pretty sharply. So it's like I think that's an inverse log curve, I think is how that is described.
Where it drops, yeah.
Yes. So it starts off very high, a lot of individuals over the age, and then as you start getting to a certain point, it very gently starts to drop off, and then you get to a certain point, and it very quickly drops off as you get old. So like I said, humans, where a lot of babies live to adulthood nowadays, and then adults live your 60, 70, 80 years, but then once you get to that advanced age, like 70s, 80s, and beyond, the number of individuals in a generation drops pretty quickly as those individuals start to die. And then you do, of course, have some stragglers that live longer, but that usually the numbers get very few at that point. Type 2 is typically when you look at like things like birds, where you'll have them, of course, they have a lot of young at once, and it's pretty much a straight downward decline over time. So those eggs hatch, most of the eggs hatch, but not all of them, over the whole, and this is over a whole generation. You know, of course, there's different factors for each cluster and species, things like that. But just over time, those numbers just steadily decline. Only so many eggs hatch and numbers decline. So many, then at that point, you say maybe half the young make it to adulthood. And then there's just, those numbers are just steadily a downward trend. And as they get older, the numbers get lower and lower until eventually the whole generation has then died. And then the type 3 is something, especially when we're looking at plants or very small, typically prey species of animals, where they have a lot of young early, but very few of them actually make it to adulthood, especially in your large plants like trees. I think in here it uses like an oak tree. So they produce hundreds to thousands of acorns, the seeds at once, but only a couple of them make it to the point where they actually are able to start to sprout and become young trees. And then whatever other factors, whether they're eaten, trampled, outcompeted by larger already established trees, only a handful of them actually make it to adulthood. But once they do make it to adulthood, they tend to live much longer. So it's a very quick drop at the beginning until pretty much adulthood. But once they reach adulthood, they are pretty well able to survive for however long those specific organisms tend to live. In the case of trees, they tend to live a long time. So once they make it to adulthood, they pretty much are able to persist for a while. Or even things like rodents, things that have a lot of young, the ones that do make it to adulthood typically do okay compared to the amount of young that started in the generation. Those adults, that they typically make it longer and then are able to have more young. So those are the kind of the 3 like we said, survivorship curves. Those 3 very distinct breeding strategies. There's pluses and minuses to each. The type 1, larger organisms that do care for their young a lot, care for them very well. They tend to have those fewer young, but they make it to adulthood. But that takes a lot more energy and resource from the parent to get them to adulthood. But once they're there, they're pretty well off. Whereas in type 3, especially things like plants that don't move, don't have parental care, they produce a lot of very small young, and then they just kind of, it's like luck of the draw. If they do manage to make it to adulthood, then they're in good shape, but it's kind of a quantity over quality. So you have less, not as strong initially young, in the hopes that some make it to adulthood, over the type 1 where you only have a few young that tend to be very strong and well adapted that are most likely going to make it to adulthood. And then that type 2 is kind of the in-between. So that does influence a lot in the way of why different organisms do what they do, why you only you see things survive to adulthood more readily than others. Like I said, there's different strategies to each. The amount of energy, a lot of it especially comes to the amount of energy from the parent to get that young to adulthood. That's a major factor in that. But Tyler, do you have anything that you want to add to this?
I do not. You covered it really well. The more you nurture your young, the longer they live, pretty much. Also
better chance they have at making it.
But that's all we have for today's episode, I believe. Alex, anything before I wrap this up?
I think that's all I've got.
It's late. It's 10 o'clock at night for us.
Yes, yeah. We're trying to sneak this in before the storm.
Sneaking in before the storm. Alex is running on 0 sleep from a child.
Yes.
So we're hunkering down here. Make sure to follow us on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure you follow us so you stay up to date whenever we upload new episodes. We try to get them out every Sunday at 7. Hold us to it this year, please.
Yes, we're doing our best. We're trying.
Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Life Complete Story. I typically try to post a clip or something throughout the week about something cool, or from the episode that we're talking about. Send us an email at lifecompletestory@gmail.com for any questions, comments, things of that nature that don't quite fit in a comment box. And make sure to follow us on Facebook at Life the Complete Story for news articles that we find interesting. That sums it up. That should be it.
Yes, sir. Alex. Yeah, I think sounds like it.
Wrap us up.
Thank you again for joining us for another episode of Life the Complete Story. I've been Alex, and that has been Tyler. We were your hosts for today. And as we say at the end of every episode, keep on learning. You'll never know what you find interesting. And we'll see you all next time.